Over a year ago at this point, Pixar finally returned to theaters after being shafted by Disney on Disney Plus due to the pandemic. Films like Luca and Turning Red were just straight up released on their own and still received positive views, something that was fine on its own and easily accessible to people to enjoy these Pixar movies ever since Onward was released at the wrong time when the world shut down. And as a result of this was the release of Lightyear back. The film built up as the ultimate return for families, which actually turned out for the worse rather than the better when the film eventually bombed because people found out it was generic and very boring. Something that was not because of two girls kissing existing in a film that hardly warranted any controversy at all other than coming out of a corporate woke Disney if that's what people were looking for. But if that's what they were looking for, then you really shouldn't be watching movies at all solely on those points alone. Realizing that the film sucked because of the shortcomings as a story that tanked it and Pixar's theatrical image as a result for Disney. The one where most people got turned off by the studio as a theater-going experience that I really got worried about because they weren't providing reason for people to come back, as is the case of what people experienced with the fears of Elemental following some same generic love story plot that resulted in the studio's lowest box office opening after Toy Story, which thankfully it was eventually saved by a stronger word of mouth and the story resemblance of what you would expect out of Pixar with emotional storytelling rather than the bland crap that Lightyear produced. How this film's exact return really didn't do Disney any favors for the better, using a familiar IP slapped onto a movie thinking it would attract attention but ultimately didn't because it never felt like an actual story to get invested in. It felt like something to be released on Disney Plus instead because of those points rather than a new compelling movie like what Turning Red could have provided for them that was released in the same year as Lightyear. Away from COVID that could have done decent numbers for the studio in theaters before releasing on streaming platform later on. Something Elemental has actually clearly shown us where it could have succeeded more if it weren't for the date and reception of Lightyear that made Pixar into a Disney Plus feature rather than a theatrical one. And so with that said, I thought we'd revisit a movie no one cares about anymore at this point and see the underlying problem that Disney kept pushing for in a movie with no real interesting story. One where Disney already had interesting one in Buzz Lightyear of Star Command, a series that better explains the reason why Andy would actually get Buzz in the first place rather than what they say this mediocre nonsense actually produced. One where they refuse to acknowledge its existence by how it's still not on Disney Plus now amongst other classic Disney shows that I personally grew up with. This is something that makes me question the point of having this service if everything you've owned isn't even up there, because everything involved with this film has also been thrown away, notably when Lightyear's own director and co-director of Finding Dory was actually laid off, a part of the 75 who were let go at Pixar after Disney's restructuring, somewhat admitting to us that this film was a mistake, which it really was no matter how great the animation looks. A style that is trying to be more real but sadly didn't do anything for the story. I mean, try all you might to make something as real as possible like this, but that doesn't excuse you for not providing a decent movie to actually come out of it. Like, no matter how adventurous you might paint the movie to be, you still lack the charm that most of Pixar movies offer, being bright and colorful that kids can actually connect with and ones that adults can actually understand with its deeper meanings. Something instead of a world that just feels generic and not full of life except for the robots and humans that mainly inhabit it. Yes, there are other alien life forms in the film, but not in the sense like the humanoid ones that talk in the series that actually interact with such an intergalactic organization like Star Command. Like, where's the aliens we should expect with Buzz Lightyear and the world that he built being the Space Ranger? Where's that sense of wackiness we actually associate that with too? And where's the energetic Buzz that we actually fell in love with? One we have seen in Tim Allen's portrayal of the character, now replaced with the monotonous portrayal that Chris Evans did in the world that somehow inspired Andy to get Buzz in Toy Story in the first place. Because this is the movie that tries to paint itself as the reason that Andy actually got him, as we see in the opening, which is also the reason why it actually overall sucked, because instead of having a movie on its own, it just found more reasons to attach itself to existing IP with a stupid movie within a movie concept that never actually makes sense most of the time. Because this is something that contradicts several points to why it happened the way it did when Buzz was actually portrayed in personality and advertisement in the Toy Story films. Something that includes Star Command in that picture amongst the many toys actually featured in Toy Story 2, where that very movie actually showed more of what Buzz's own adventures were really like, including his video game, establishing the world and setting that actually comes with it, where although it was very short, it was also very fun and fit the image of what Lightyear was truly like. But sadly, that isn't exactly how it happened, because it all came from this film in this very universe that it's probably supposed live action that was Andy's favorite, where that is something that somehow feels like it really didn't happen at all. But it's something that it wants to tell you guys that this was the exact movie, that this was the reason the events of Toy Story happened in some ways back in 1995 with what we had. But as we find out what it really had, it actually didn't actually feel that way at all. How we know this because most people really didn't connect with it much when it bombed at the box office, so it really made the whole state statement about Andy very stupid in practice. How it makes this entire line a tone-deaf statement when they produce something like Buzz Lightyear of Star Command that fits every piece of media that we have directly seen in Toy Story and the character of Buzz Lightyear in the film exactly to how he is, compared to how this one, as we find out later with characters like Zurg, actually don't. But basically, this starts us off with the movie with Buzz and his friend on a mission from Star Command exploring signs of life on the world of Takani Prime. And what this is trying to establish here to the audience is that Buzz's main motivation for the entire film is to focus on the goal of accomplishing the mission no matter the cost, to do things for the better of Star Command and the people so that they can complete whatever they want to do. One that gets their ship caught because of a mistake he did to return them back home due to the hostile and alien life on the planet, where we learn how serious Buzz takes everything to accomplish his goals for the better, which causes his ultimate failure. Ones where you really don't like how they actually wrote Buzz finally to be this serious to fit the unsaturated tone and look of the movie, something Pixar is not generally known for doing in all of their work and main characters. I'm not saying I dislike this setup because the beginning part had something promising to it, but just not for Buzz Lightyear in that regard, for a story that clearly wanted to be something else rather than based off what was overall, because nothing is really matching the tone that gets you invested in his character really that much, constantly focusing on the mission to get people back home, because the character is already used to going to planet with other alien characters, and this actually just involves a bunch of humans on a mission in space that is hardly something interesting enough to actually care about, because Buzz is caring about completing that by volunteering to test the hyperspace travel that will get them home, and because of that, the time dilation makes it 4 minutes into 4 years in space, causing him to miss things like his friend getting engaged, amongst other things like everyone else aging and settling down in a new colony that they establish. One where I give the film the benefit of the doubt of having characters like Socks, the best character in the film that is voiced by none other than Peter Sohn himself, the voice of many great Pixar characters, and of course the director of Good Dinosaur and the one and only Elemental itself. I find him to be a nice companion to help Buzz whenever he went, and of course somehow encouraged him to do the mission despite everything that had happened, and probably will happen again in a toned down version of Interstellar, and how time passes in that. Because in this short sequence, we see how he doesn't give up to try to accomplish to bring them home, and how his friend Alicia Hawthorne grows up with her family. How we see he's happy for her in this short amount of time, but it doesn't give enough time for him to think about what he's doing when we see everyone around him settling into life on the planet and this colony, that they don't care about what he's doing because they're focused on trying to live right here, and they're actually fine with it. To be fixated on something else to do something that clearly isn't working instead. Like you really don't feel invested into it because of how he keeps trying to do it and how everyone just really doesn't relatively care about that point, not rushing to the end, where eventually he does it enough times where she actually passes due to old age, not really thinking about that point and listening to her about what is happening when he learned the first time he actually did it, doing the same thing over and over, expecting something different. I mean, it's not a completely bad concept to do so, but it introduces something overall stupid with how illogical most characters' decisions really are, once again being a part of Buzz's character that Andy was supposed to fall in love with, and it's not really given the time to show it. One where he's not actually making the choices a Space Ranger would do, how it really doesn't feel like the setting that he would be a part of. Again, where you have to compare the video game part of Toy Story 2 in the very beginning, one where it actually starts off with a bang that sets the tone of the character that we know and trying to accomplish missions and stopping Zurg wherever he goes, where now in this movie, instead, everyone else has moved on from Buzz's point where they're doing relatively normal stuff in the entire course of the film, how there's no need to go back in space because they live content on this new planet. Well, that is in fact all except for Buzz, because he doesn't realize what he's focused on in that mission. Because this is something that makes the point of how they present the villain absolutely useless because of how he needs to go back and try to do it again, where now it all starts off because they were going to decommission Socks since everyone was fine where they were. And it's something that just really happens like that without any explanation to it at all. Like when he's there, they just need to do this now because of what has already happened, which somehow meant that he had to go back there because this damn cat is just too cute and too important to actually let go and continuing the mission overall. Nothing here is actually built up again properly, and it just rushes to the next point with little time to actually explain why they should be happening this way. It's not given any reason to why people should be logically doing this. And it's a point where they have to travel again, this time a lot faster and further in time, with 22 years now passing, and now the planet planet being invaded by Zurg and his bots for some reason, which gets us to our newer main characters like Izzy, the granddaughter of Alicia, and the other two a part of the crew that I really couldn't find fun or interesting at all. Like, this entire part of the movie that makes up most of its runtime really doesn't feel compelling or investing at all, because they are doing minor things here and there and trying to solve their Zurg problem, something I tried to find the time to explain, but it really feels pointless doing nothing interesting to overall forward Buzz's story until the reveal later on. Like, I get it's great for Buzz to meet his new main crew in the film, but they aren't the brightest spots ever, where he missed everything about his past at this point to really care, and only now trying to have something that isn't given to have time at all. Like, this entire section could be cut out to actually explain what has happened in the past much better, rather than what this entire section really is about. It really feels like almost 50% of the movie is just given time to them going on mistakes and trying to get out of it, with nothing actually better to do. There isn't a single reason given to forward the story in any way until the villain actually directly impacts them, where in its most basic essence, this entire section is nothing but filler. Filler in a Pixar movie nonetheless, where it's something they aren't really known for doing, at least to this extent. Because looking back at their past shows that this is something you honestly do not expect a studio like this one to do, where even at the very least, their least liked movies actually had something to get invested the way through from the beginning to the end, where this one hardly has that at all, with a major chunk of the film focused on this solely and nothing else, not really connecting with the beginning about its experiences or what we should expect that involves Buzz, where this actually feels like the least liked episode in the series instead. But even then, the lamer episodes of Buzz Lightyear Star Command actually had more interesting action and story plots to offer than this overall. Like, you really feel that this section could have been trimmed down or something to actually explain it a little bit better to the past and why Buzz should be keeping doing this, but they actually just didn't do it because they wanted to actually have Buzz's connection with these characters we don't really get invested into at all. And as a result, this causes us to pick up in action when Zurg just finally comes back into view for some reason, causing them to escape in this alright action sequence that I feel fine with. One that gets Buzz caught separated from the group and faced with Zurg himself. But then finally, after this short sequence when they're led apart, is how we are led to the worst twist villain that Pixar has ever done. Maybe not as infuriating as The Incredibles 2 in my opinion for being so damn stupid within the world, but seriously the worst concerning the characters that they are all based on. One where Zurg actually turned out to be an older Buzz Lightyear himself, which is something that completely ruins the entire point of Zurg's character, especially once again from Toy Story 2, where at this point you'd be surprised to see that Toy Story 2 is more of a Lightyear movie than the Lightyear movie ever was for him, because in that film we established that Toy Zurg is actually Buzz's father, one clearly done in a Star Wars parody moment and something set up very different for an evil villain and a good guy hero, something that actually makes more sense than this ever could and what was actually built up in that story, even though it was not focused on those points and what we learned at the very beginning with the Buzz Lightyear video game, it actually makes more sense. But the movie's version of this is all to tie back into the point of earlier when Buzz continued the mission on once again. The explanation for this is the fact that this Buzz is split from that time they went into hyperspace. The Buzz we know traveled further in time, where this one actually worked to extend like they wanted, but they wanted to arrest him instead for illegally stealing the ship once again that he actually didn't care to know about. Like, he forgets the point that he stupidly expected to become a hero after completing the mission successfully to return, and did not once think about the point about people here settled down and had comfortable lives to begin with, which makes sense from their point of view, but not from the point of view of Buzz, who's doing the most illogical things ever, where instead of this he just leaves and travels further into the future and stole this equipment and managed to find a way back in time so that they can erase the mistake they ever made from crashing theirs they made at the beginning of the film so that they can actually go home instead. This is where you realize that this entire plot of the film is the lamest one that Pixar has ever crafted, where it's just about fixing the mistakes to go home and that's it. No grand lesson or emotional investing journey that we learn along the way that we expect out of the studio, and just something done because it's there, and I guess that's it. But there is just no way you can convince your audience, especially the new kids introduced in this world, that this was the right choice to actually make, because when you use Buzz Lightyear, you'd expect him to go against the evil Emperor Zurg that plans to rule the galaxy and whatnot, and one that turns out to be his father just like Darth Vader was when he ruled the galaxy, and something that isn't actually himself from the future finding this new tech bent on this new mission, because that hardly makes any sense to the world world unless you were building a completely different film that is removed from the character of Toy Story. It's something that's also made dumber by the fact his name is Zurg because the robots cannot say Buzz, programmed to be jumbled to saying Zurg instead, which of course some could actually think hints at another Zurg, or just a lazy attempt to explain why Buzz jumbled up together just makes sense for Zurg in some way. I mean, at the very least for this, I will give them credit for trying to do what Toy Story 2 did by somewhat making Buzz think that his older self was actually his father in some way, but that's also something that's lazy and writing off what we already know of the character rather than flowing logically like a story actually should. But the worst thing above all about this point is that it makes Toy Story look more irrelevant because of what Buzz Lightyear's character was originally thought of when he talked to Woody and his world and his character designed to stop Zurg, how he knows the secret to this weapon that can destroy planets so he can actually conquer it. Another parody of Star Wars in a way where he knows what he's doing to protect the galaxy and not lazily fix mistakes instead. How this is a point that contradicts everything Andy got invested in clearly because the only popular character in the film was Socks himself and not Buzz because he's also the main villain in a way just like the main hero. How this point doesn't actually make sense for Buzz himself to actually think about him failing at hyperspace travel and constantly meeting with a bunch of misfits who have nothing better to do for the story. Like nothing was explained to how he just appears like that in the plot and nothing else, going back to fix everything but destroying everything else without little reason to what actually developed over the years where people stopped caring at all. It is not only contradictory to Toy Story itself with the Buzz's own character in that film, but also to its own plot with what was already established with Lightyear's own character at the very beginning, where it just sets up a little bit of what he goes through but just stops caring about that to do whatever it takes, including stopping his younger self from stopping him. It's just so bad where the only thing worth talking about this film is the pathetic twist villain that made no sense because the movie had nothing to warrant itself anything interesting to. Like, why are you going this route when the character was actually designed one specific way that was actually more fun and fit within the tones of the Three Little Men and whatnot? This is just not what you expect the character of Buzz Lightyear's world to actually be pictured by. They're staying on one planet, barely going into space and nothing more. And of course, because of that, this is the part where they all have to go and try to stop him and successfully do so, seemingly blowing him up and stopping the mission forever, but also really not actually killing him in the process because the end credits actually showed that he actually survived to some extent that would actually go nowhere because of the fact that this film bombed. And then finally crashing back onto the planet for doing a job well done to stop him, and now Buzz finally accepted his life on Tikani Prime to complete his entire mistake. And finally, as a result of this, the commander actually allows the revival of the Space Ranger Corps with Buzz and his friends, thus completing the mission and the movie. Overall, with what we got and what we learned is that nothing was really earned and the movie was just a slog to get through. It's a world that doesn't feel important and just very bland, where it's really a movie that you wouldn't expect Pixar to actually make at all. At no point did it ever warrant itself being a part of the grand return to theaters, and it really showed. It clearly wanted to be something more real, grounded, and mature for a lot of grown-ups to see for a Pixar film, but it really just used the wrong elements to make it that way, ultimately making it a boring experience overall. It's one that never gives reason to why Andy actually got Buzz Lightyear when its most popular character isn't even shown in the world of Toy Story to begin with, where in a way, now that I think about it, this is Pixar's version of what a Disney live-action remake is, or a spin-off where it clearly didn't work at all. But overall, this isn't to say that people can't enjoy it, because I clearly don't hate it and see some of its merits for what it wanted, but just how it really wanted to attach itself to Pixar's past brands, and the fact it comes from Pixar known for doing things one way, where this feels like doing the complete opposite in the other. How it just set up poor expectations to doing things in the story that ultimately no one actually wanted to see when it actually came out, and what we actually saw in the film, with characters making stupid decisions for most of the movie, and how it actually ended up as filler instead. And this is a point mainly seen once again in films like Elemental, that while not quite as good as the golden age of Pixar films, it still had the heart of what was from before and succeeded to some degree despite relatively opening poorly compared to Lightyear. How these films actually contrast very differently in attitudes to what a Pixar film actually really looks like, one having an actual emotional story that attaches to their name, while the other one really has none of it. How Elemental is really a film that showcased what Lightyear was missing and what it wasn't in a Pixar film, in a story that would have actually been successful in its own right if it used the elements in a way that actually made sense to the basis of the character, or just doing something originally instead of a spin-off. But sadly, that is something that didn't work out that way and turned out to be a massive failure in the end that affected Pixar's image for the worst when most of their productions are actually good overall experiences instead. So overall, Lightyear turned out to be a major lesson of Disney dragging something too far and getting nothing as a result, and showing how original films like Elemental succeeding because it wasn't being something it was not and new for the sake of audiences instead, giving reason to actually watch Pixar once again. And with that said, that's all I have to say say, I'm all done. Goodbye.